They left me the house. Their kids called it manipulation. Discovery revealed who actually showed up, and who was already emailing real estate agents while their father was still alive. I've debated posting this for a long time. Some of you will think I'm embellishing. Some of you will think I did something wrong. But I'm posting it because I know there are people out there who have built real families outside of blood, and I want them to know that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the law catches up with the truth. My name isn't important. I'm 45, I live in a mid-sized city in the American Midwest, and for the past 12 years, I have called a cream-colored craftsman house on Maple Street my home. Past tense and present tense simultaneously, which will make sense by the end. This is the story of how I almost lost it, and what I had to do to keep it. Background: how I got here. I moved into the house when I was 33. Freshly divorced, 2 years sober, working as a mid-level project manager for a logistics company. I had enough income to rent something decent but not enough emotional bandwidth to handle a sterile apartment complex where nobody knew your name. I needed quiet. I needed routine. I needed, though I wouldn't have admitted it then, people. The listing was modest. 2-bedroom rental on Maple Street. Private yard. Garage. Utilities partially covered. Seeking long-term, responsible tenant. No smoking. References required. The rent was below market, which I initially found suspicious. I drove by 3 times before I called. The landlords were Walter and Edna Kowalski. Walter was 74 at the time. Edna was 71. They had owned the house for 40 years, raised their children there, buried a dog in the backyard, planted a rose trellis along the back fence that had grown wild and gorgeous over the decades. They had downsized to a smaller home 2 streets over after their youngest left for college, and rather than sell the old house, they'd been renting it for about 8 years. I came to the walkthrough expecting a business transaction. What I got was a kitchen table covered in coffee mugs, a plate of Edna's walnut cake, and 2 hours of conversation that ranged from my recovery to Walter's opinions on the Chicago Bears to Edna's detailed critique of contemporary rose hybridization. They asked for my references, checked them carefully, and called me 3 days later. "Walter says you're the one," Edna told me on the phone, with the quiet certainty of someone who had learned to trust her husband's instincts over half a century of marriage. "We'd like you to move in the first of the month." I signed a lease. Standard terms. Nothing unusual. I paid my rent on time every single month for 12 years, a fact that would later become one brick in a very important wall. The early years. How business became family. The first year was polite. I mowed the lawn without being asked. Walter stopped by occasionally to check on a fussy section of the fence. Edna brought over a casserole when I had a respiratory infection that kept me home for 2 weeks. Normal landlord-tenant warmth. Pleasant but boundaried. The second year, Walter had a minor stroke. It wasn't catastrophic, his speech came back fully within weeks, and his mobility was barely affected, but it frightened Edna in a way I could see from 2 streets over. She was suddenly alone in a house with a man who needed help, and her children, I'll get to them, lived far away and visited rarely. I started driving them to appointments. Not because anyone asked me to, but because one Tuesday morning I saw Edna struggling to help Walter into a taxi and something in me simply moved without consulting my brain. I knocked on the car window, sent the taxi away, and drove them to the cardiologist myself. Walter fell asleep on the way home with his head against the window, and Edna cried very quietly in the passenger seat and didn't explain why and didn't need to. After that, it became a rhythm. Tuesday appointments. Saturday garden work. Sunday dinners that started as occasional invitations and solidified, somewhere around year 3, into a standing arrangement so established that Edna simply set 3 places without asking. I want to be clear about something. I was not performing. I was not angling for anything. I was a recovering alcoholic in his mid-30s who had destroyed his marriage and spent too many years treating relationships as things to be endured rather than cultivated. Walter and Edna were, in ways that are embarrassing to admit out loud, the first healthy family dynamic I had ever participated in. Walter taught me how to properly repair a fence post, how to read a weather system by the color of the evening sky, how to lose an argument with dignity. Edna taught me that cooking for someone is a language, that a garden is a conversation with time, that a person's worth is not measured by what they produce but by what they notice. I became their emergency contact. Not because they assigned me formally, that came later, but because when Walter's cardiologist asked who to call, Walter said my name without hesitation, and nobody thought to question it. The children, a portrait in absence. Walter and Edna had 3 children. I'll call them by their roles rather than their names, because this is the internet and also because their names are less important than what they represent. There was the eldest son, who lived in Phoenix and called on holidays with the precision of someone managing a to-do list. He was in finance. Successful. The kind of successful that insulates people from consequences. There was the middle daughter, who had moved to the Pacific Northwest and occupied a philosophical position she described as intentional distance from family systems. She visited approximately once every 18 months, always with the air of someone completing a meaningful errand. There was the youngest son, who was the warmest of the three and the most guilty about being absent. He called more frequently, sent cards for birthdays, occasionally flew in for a weekend. He had 3 children of his own and legitimate competing demands on his life. I have always felt the most complicated about the youngest, because his absence was the absence of capacity rather than desire. The other 2 simply chose differently. None of them were present when Walter's Parkinson's diagnosis came in year 7. I drove him home from the neurologist. I sat with him in the driveway for 40 minutes while he processed it, neither of us speaking. When we went inside, Edna was standing at the kitchen counter and she looked at Walter's face and understood immediately. I made coffee none of us drank. We sat there together in the way that people sit together when language fails. That night, I called the eldest to let him know. I had to leave a voicemail. He called back 2 days later and asked clinical questions and said they should all get together soon. They did not. Over the following years, Walter's Parkinson's progressed. Not quickly. He fought it with the methodical stubbornness of a man who had grown up working with his hands, but steadily. I became less a tenant and more a household member. I installed safety rails. I drove him to physical therapy twice a week. I learned enough about his medication schedule to catch a dangerous pharmacy error that Walter's own children would not have caught because they did not know his dosages. When Walter could no longer reliably navigate stairs, I spent a weekend converting the downstairs study into a bedroom, recruited a neighbor who owed me a favor for the plumbing adjustment needed for a bathroom modification, and split the cost with Edna without telling her what I'd paid. She found out later. She cried. I told her it was nothing. It was not nothing. But it was also not a transaction. Year 10. The conversation I didn't expect. Walter had a bad winter in year 10. 2 hospitalizations. A fall in January that bruised his hip and frightened all of us. By March, he was mostly stable but diminished in ways that were hard to watch. One afternoon in April, I was sitting with him on the back porch. The rose trellis was coming into bloom, Edna's annual triumph, and Walter was watching it with the focused pleasure of a man who has learned to treat each sensory experience as potentially the last good one. He said, without preamble, "We're leaving you the house." I didn't respond immediately. I think I assumed I'd misheard. "Edna and I talked about it," he continued. "We talked about it for a long time. We want you to have it." He paused. "You've been here, son. Every day you've been here." I told him I didn't want him thinking about that. I told him he was going to be fine. He gave me the look of a man in his 80s with Parkinson's who has earned the right to find gentle deflection mildly insulting. "I'm not telling you for comfort," he said. "I'm telling you so you know. So you can be ready." I didn't know how to respond, so I told him the truth, that the house was already home, and that I didn't need a deed to know that. He nodded like I'd said something correct but insufficient. "The deed matters," he said. "When I'm gone, the deed is what they'll look at." I understood later that he was warning me. Year 11. The documents. Walter and Edna updated their estate plan in year 11. They had a long-standing relationship with an estate attorney, a careful woman I'll call Ms. Harrington, who had been managing their documents for over a decade. They brought me into one meeting, not as a party, but as someone they wanted to be present, and walked me through what they'd decided. The house on Maple Street would transfer to me outright upon the death of the surviving spouse. Their other assets, savings, investments, the contents of their smaller home, would be divided among their 3 children per a formula they developed after long deliberation. The children would receive the bulk of the financial estate. I would receive the house. Ms. Harrington was meticulous. She documented Walter and Edna's mental competency at the time of signing. She had them recorded on video explaining their intentions in their own words. She walked through the family history, their relationship with their children, their relationship with me. She was, I understood later, building a record specifically because she anticipated a challenge. When I mentioned this to Walter afterward, he smiled grimly. "She's good at her job," he said. I asked him if he thought his children would fight it. He was quiet for a while. "The eldest will," he said finally. "He's always thought about what things are worth. Not what they mean. What they're worth." He wasn't wrong. Update 1. The deaths and the letters. Edna died first, which surprised everyone including Walter. A stroke, fast and largely painless, on a Tuesday morning in October. She had been in the garden the day before. I had been there too, cutting back the roses for winter, and she had told me which varieties were her favorites and which ones she'd always regretted planting and why. Ordinary conversation. Last conversation. Walter declined quickly after that. Not because the Parkinson's accelerated dramatically, but because he simply stopped fighting it. He moved into a care facility in February, one I had researched carefully and visited multiple times before recommending it to him. I visited him every other day. I brought him the newspaper and the crossword and occasionally a piece of the walnut cake I had learned to make from Edna's recipe, which was imperfect but recognizable enough that it made him smile. He died in April, 8 months after Edna. He was 87. I was with him. The eldest was in Phoenix. The middle daughter was in Portland. The youngest arrived 4 hours after Walter passed, red-eyed and stricken, and I sat with him in the care facility's family room while he cried and apologized for things he couldn't have changed. I meant it when I told him none of it was his fault. 3 weeks after Walter's death, I received a letter from an attorney I had never heard of. It was addressed to me as current occupant of the house on Maple Street, a deliberately impersonal address that told me everything I needed to know about the tone of what followed. The eldest, the middle daughter, and, to my deep disappointment, the youngest had joined together to contest the will. Their argument, rendered in the formal language of legal correspondence, was essentially this: Walter and Edna Kowalski had been elderly, infirm, and subject to undue influence from a non-family member who had inserted himself into their lives specifically to manipulate their estate planning decisions. The house on Maple Street was rightfully part of the estate to be divided among their biological heirs. My claim to it was the product of manipulation, not genuine affection. I read the letter 3 times. Then I called Ms. Harrington. Update 2, building the case. I expected this, Ms. Harrington told me, in a tone that was neither surprised nor alarmed. I want you to know that Walter and Edna expected this too. That's why we were so careful. She walked me through what we had. The video documentation of Walter and Edna's stated intentions, recorded in year 11, was the cornerstone. 2 mental competency evaluations, conducted by independent physicians, confirmed that both Walter and Edna were fully competent at the time of signing. There was a paper trail of my lease payments, 12 years of on-time rent, documented meticulously, that directly undermined the narrative that I had been living there as some kind of opportunistic interloper. There were letters that Walter and Edna had written to Ms. Harrington, in their own handwriting, explaining their reasoning in detail. But documentation alone, Ms. Harrington explained, does not always win these cases. Undue influence claims are subjective. Juries and judges are sometimes susceptible to the emotional narrative of grieving biological children, even when the facts don't support the claim. We needed to demonstrate not just that the documents were legitimate, but that the relationship was real. That meant building a different kind of record. I spent 3 weeks going through 12 years of accumulated life. I had, without ever intending it as a legal strategy, kept a remarkable amount of documentation. Not formally, not in any way that anticipated this fight, but simply because I am by nature an organized person and because my relationship with Walter and Edna had been woven into the practical fabric of my daily existence. I had 12 years of rent receipts. Every single one. I had Walter's medical appointment calendar, which I had maintained on my phone for the last 6 years because his memory for dates had become unreliable. It showed 847 individual appointment entries. I had the pharmacy records showing I was the pickup contact for Walter's medications for the last 4 years of his life. I had text messages, hundreds of them, with Edna, ranging from, "Can you pick up milk on your way?" to long, discursive conversations about her roses and my work and the nature of aging and what she hoped people would remember about her. I had photographs. Dozens of birthdays, Thanksgivings, ordinary Tuesdays. Walter teaching me to replace a section of fence post. Edna showing me the correct way to prune a climbing rose. Both of them at my company's holiday party in year 4, where I had brought them as my guests because I had no one else to bring and they had seemed delighted by the invitation. I had letters, actual handwritten letters, that Edna had left on my kitchen table over the years, slid under the door when I was at work. Notes about the garden, about recipes, about things she'd been thinking. Notes that ended with words like "with so much love and your Edna" and, once, simply your family. I organized everything chronologically. I prepared a summary document. I gave it to Ms. Harrington. She read through it, made notes, and looked up at me with an expression that was professional but warm. "This is not the file of a man who manipulated 2 elderly people," she said. "This is the file of a man who showed up." Update 3, the deposition. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday in October, almost exactly 1 year after Edna's death. I had been advised by Ms. Harrington and the litigation attorney she had brought in, a methodical man I'll call David, to remain calm, answer questions precisely, and not editorialize. The opposing attorney was skilled. She was warm in a way that was designed to disarm, and she had clearly studied the file carefully. Her strategy was visible within the first 20 minutes. She wanted to establish that I had been present at every major decision point, that I had accompanied Walter and Edna to their estate attorney, that I had a financial interest in the outcome, and that my presence in their lives had crowded out their children. I answered her questions directly. Yes, I had accompanied them to estate planning meetings, when they asked me to. Yes, I lived nearby and was present frequently, because I was their tenant and, over time, their family. Yes, I stood to benefit from the will, as did their children, who would receive the financial estate. Then she asked a question I had been expecting and had spent considerable time thinking about. Mr. Name redacted, would you describe yourself as closer to Walter and Edna Kowalski than their own children were? I paused before answering. David had told me to pause, not for effect, but because pauses protect you from saying things you'll regret. I was present, I said. I was there when Walter was diagnosed with Parkinson's. I was there during both of Edna's hospitalizations. I drove them to their appointments and sat with them when they were frightened and made them dinner when they were too tired to cook. I'm not in a position to characterize the relationship their children had with them. I can only tell you what I saw and what I did. She pressed. But you were there more than they were. I lived 2 streets away, I said. I was available in a way that required no sacrifice of my own. Their children had their own lives, their own distances. I'm not making a comparative argument. Walter and Edna made their own decisions about who to include in their estate planning. I didn't ask for the house. I was told about it 3 years before Walter died, and I told him it wasn't necessary. There was a pause. Why would you say that, if you didn't want the house? Because I was afraid of exactly this, I said. I was afraid that doing what felt natural and right, being present, being useful, being part of their lives, would look like something calculated. I was afraid that love can look like a long con if you choose to view it that way. The room was quiet for a moment. And yet you accepted the bequest. Yes, I said. Because Walter asked me to. Because he said the deed matters. Because Edna wrote me a letter 6 months before she died that is in your discovery documents, in which she says, and I'm quoting from memory, that house is yours because you made it a home again, and we want you to know that we knew the difference between someone who was there for what we had and someone who was there for who we were. She wrote that. On a Tuesday in April, at her kitchen table, on the stationery she kept in the drawer by the phone. Update 4. What the discovery revealed. Here is where the story shifts in a way I hadn't anticipated. Our legal team requested discovery, which meant the opposing side had to produce documentation relevant to the case. They had argued that Walter and Edna's true wishes were being subverted, that they had been isolated from their children and manipulated by a predatory tenant. Discovery was meant to support that narrative. Instead, it undermined it. The phone records were particularly stark. In the final 3 years of Walter's life, the period during which the opposing attorneys were arguing that I had isolated him from his family, there were 14 phone calls from the eldest, 9 from the middle daughter, and 31 from the youngest. The calls averaged under 8 minutes. There were 1,247 calls, texts, and messages between me and Walter's phone during the same period. The eldest had visited twice in Walter's final 3 years. Both visits were under 48 hours. The middle daughter had visited once, for a long weekend, shortly after Edna's death. The youngest had visited 4 times, the most of any of them. I want to be very careful here, because I have thought about this part of the story a great deal. I am not posting this to vilify Walter and Edna's children. The youngest, in particular, is not a villain in this story. He is a man who was stretched thin between his own family and aging parents who lived far away, and who made choices that I think he will regret for a long time, but that I do not think were made for malice. Even the eldest and the middle daughter were not evil. They were, I think, people who had complicated relationships with their parents that long predated my arrival on Maple Street, and who found it easier to maintain emotional distance than to do the difficult work of proximity. But here is what the discovery also revealed, and this I will state plainly. The eldest had, in the 18 months following Edna's death, communicated with a real estate agent about the potential listing price of the house on Maple Street. He had done this while Walter was still alive and while the will contest was not yet filed. He had done this without telling his father. Ms. Harrington flagged this when the emails came through in discovery. She showed them to me quietly, with the expression of someone who has seen this before. "This is why Walter told you the deed matters," she said. Resolution. The ruling. The case went before a probate judge rather than a jury, which our team had requested and which Ms. Harrington believed was strategically correct. Probate judges see undue influence claims constantly. They are less susceptible to the emotional narrative of grieving biological children and more focused on the documentary record. The hearing lasted 2 days. The judge was a precise woman who asked careful questions and showed no visible sympathy for either side. She reviewed the video documentation of Walter and Edna's stated intentions. She reviewed the competency evaluations. She reviewed the 12 years of lease payments, the medical records, the phone logs, the discovery materials, the letters. She noted in her ruling that the evidence presented showed a sustained pattern of care, presence, and mutual affection spanning over a decade, documented contemporaneously and consistently, which bears no resemblance to the episodic, instrumentalized attention characteristic of undue influence cases. She noted that Walter and Edna had made their decision freely, deliberately, and with full knowledge of their children's likely objections, as evidenced by the extraordinary care they took to document their reasoning. She noted the real estate inquiry emails. She ruled in my favor. The house on Maple Street was mine. Aftermath. The youngest called me 2 days after the ruling. I almost didn't answer. I'm glad I did. He told me he was sorry. Not for contesting the will. He was honest enough to admit that he'd allowed himself to be persuaded by his brother that the claim had merit, and that he'd been too emotionally compromised in the immediate wake of his parents' deaths to think clearly. He apologized for that, specifically and without deflection. He asked if he could come and see the house sometime. He said there were things about his childhood there he wasn't ready to lose access to. I said yes. I meant it. He has visited twice now. The first time, he walked through every room very slowly. He stood in the doorway of his old bedroom, now my home office, for a long time without saying anything. He touched the rose trellis like it was something sacred. He told me stories about his mother that I hadn't known, and I told him stories about his father that he'd missed, and we sat at the kitchen table for 3 hours and ate walnut cake and talked about 2 people who had mattered to both of us. Before he left, he told me that his father had called him once, about 2 years before he died, and said, "The man in the house on Maple Street is family. I need you to understand that." The youngest said he'd thought his father was being sentimental. He understood now that Walter had been telling him something precise. The eldest has not contacted me. The middle daughter sent a brief, formal email acknowledging the ruling and stating that she intended no further legal action. I have not responded. There is nothing to say. Reflection. I am 45 years old. I have lived in this house for 12 years. I own it now, which still feels surreal in ways I cannot fully articulate, not because I feel I don't deserve it, but because the concept of owning something was so long absent from my life that the permanence of it sits strangely. I have kept Edna's rose trellis. I tend it the way she taught me, in October and in April, with the specific attention she prescribed to the specific varieties she loved. I am not a natural gardener. I make mistakes. But the trellis blooms every June with the accumulated stubbornness of something that has been tended through many imperfect winters, and when it does, I feel the particular satisfaction of maintaining something that was given to you in trust. I have kept Walter's fence posts. I replaced one this past spring. A section had finally succumbed to 12 winters, and I did it the way he taught me, with the specific care he insisted upon, checking the plumb twice and tamping the concrete properly and not rushing it. It is a small thing. It is not a small thing. People have asked me, since I started telling the story, whether I feel vindicated by the ruling. Whether it feels like justice. I always have to think about this carefully before answering, because the honest answer is complicated. Yes, it feels like justice in the narrow legal sense. The documents held up. The record held up. The truth of what we were to each other was legible to a careful reader, and the judge was a careful reader. But there is another sense in which justice is an inadequate word. What I wanted was not the house. What I wanted was for Walter to still be alive to sit on the back porch and watch the roses. What I wanted was for Edna to still be at her kitchen table on Sunday mornings with the crossword and the coffee and the unhurried patience she brought to everything she loved. The house is mine. They are gone. Those 2 facts coexist without resolution, and I think they will for a long time. What I have come to believe, and this is the thing I most want to say to anyone who is in the middle of a story like this one, is that the legal fight was not really about the house. It was about the question of what family means. The opposing attorneys wanted the court to accept a definition of family that is about bloodline and legal relationship, about the default categories that exist before anyone makes a choice. Our argument, Walter and Edna's argument, really, the argument they had been constructing for 12 years with every Sunday dinner and every appointment drive and every letter left under the door, was that family is also made. Deliberately, incrementally, through the accumulation of ordinary presence and attention. The judge agreed with Walter and Edna. I think they knew she would. I think that's why Walter warned me about the deed, and why Edna wrote those letters so carefully, and why Miss Harrington filmed everything, and why they were, the 2 of them, not afraid. They had built the case themselves, long before it was needed. They had done it simply by living truthfully, by treating the relationships they had built as the ones that mattered, and by trusting that the record of a life, the actual, granular, daily record of who showed up and when and why, would eventually speak clearly. It did. I still live at the house on Maple Street. The roses are coming up early this year. I think Edna would have had opinions about that. Edit. Thank you for the responses. To answer the most common question, yes, I did have to pay legal fees, which were significant. Ms. Harrington kept hers reasonable given the circumstances, for which I will always be grateful. To the people asking if I feel guilty about the children not getting the house, they received the financial estate, which was substantial. The house was one asset among many. They chose to contest rather than accept. Those are their choices to live with, not mine. To the people who have written to tell me about their own found families, I see you. Build the record. Show up. The rest follows.